What if the future King of England made a decision so final, so quietly devastating, that it sent a message louder than any royal statement ever could? What if that decision wasn't delivered on a balcony in front of thousands, but behind closed doors, in a way that left one brother standing in the light and the other completely shut out? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates, because that's exactly what happened. Or at least, that's what insiders claim. Imagine this scene for a moment. It's early December. Buckingham Palace looks like a postcard. White frost on the gates, wreaths on every door, guards changing formation as tourists press their faces against the railings. Everything looks calm, but behind the stone walls, something is brewing. A request has just been made. Not a public announcement, not a media leak, a private plea from Prince Harry. A plea to stand on the Buckingham Palace balcony on Christmas Day. Not for a speech, not for attention, just to be seen. But here's where things twist. Because the answer he received was not the one he expected, and it didn't come from a palace aide or some distant spokesperson. It came from Prince William himself. Before we get there, though, let's ask the question no one seems to ask out loud. Why now? Why Christmas? Why this moment, after years of interviews, accusations, and silence? Is this a sudden moment of regret, or a last attempt at legitimacy? And the bigger question, the one the public keeps whispering, was this about family or power? Let's go back a step, because the timing here is not random. This Christmas is different. It's the first major royal gathering after months of health crises, canceled appearances, and shifting public expectations. People aren't just hoping for unity, they're expecting it. A balcony appearance has become more than a tradition. It's a signal, a reassurance, a declaration that the monarchy still stands. So when insiders say Harry reached out, they're saying he understood the symbolism. He knew what that balcony meant. It wasn't just a ledge overlooking the crowd. It was a doorway back into relevance, a way to stand beside his family and be seen as part of it again. But here's what makes this moment even more dramatic. William was already planning something Harry didn't know about. Not a reunion, but a reset. A carefully controlled Christmas appearance designed to send a message without saying a word. A message that the royal family is stabilizing, closing ranks, moving forward. And Harry was not part of that plan. Not because of anger, not because of spite, but for a reason much bigger and much colder than anyone expected. Now, before we go deeper, let's pause and ask the audience something. If you were William, the future king, would you risk the most photographed moment of the year becoming a headline about family drama? Would you take that chance? Or would you shut the door? Here's what makes the situation even more intense. For Harry, this wasn't just a request. This was a shift in strategy. Sources say he didn't demand. He didn't threaten. He asked. Quietly, carefully, almost humbly. Which raises another question. Was this a moment of vulnerability or calculation? Because some believe Harry wanted the balcony for one reason, legacy. A single photograph could rewrite perception. Suddenly, he wouldn't look exiled. He'd look included, connected, royal again. And here's something most people don't realize. Standing on the balcony is not a casual tradition. It is an invitation. You cannot ask for it. You must be allowed. It is not a right. It is a signal of status. So when Harry reached out, he wasn't asking for a place to stand. He was asking for acceptance. Which brings us back to William. Insiders say he didn't respond immediately. Not because he was unsure, but because he was thinking long-term. Every decision William makes now is not just as a brother, but as a future king. And this Christmas balcony? It wasn't about nostalgia. It was about optics. Control the image, control the narrative. Let's be honest, the world has seen this family fracture before. But this time feels different. There's a silence around the royals that wasn't there before. A tightening. A sense that doors are closing quietly rather than slamming loudly. And if that sounds dramatic, it's because it is. Because the moment Harry made that request, everything shifted. Not publicly, not immediately, but behind the scenes. Advisors reacted. Phone calls were made. Schedules were quietly adjusted. And then something unexpected happened. Someone stepped in. Someone Harry did not anticipate. And before William could deliver his final answer, the entire situation changed direction. Not because of emotion, not because of forgiveness, but because of a warning. A warning that made William stop and reconsider everything. But here's the twist. Reconsidering did not mean agreeing. It meant preparing for the moment when the answer would be delivered. And when it finally came, it wasn't just a no. It was a message, one that spoke louder than any interview, book, or headline. And if you think the story ends there, it doesn't. Because the real shock came after the rejection, and no one saw it coming. Oh, let's slow this down for a moment. Because before that final answer was given, something happened inside the palace that changed the tone of everything. It wasn't a crisis. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't even an argument. It was a realization. A realization that this Christmas was not just another date on the calendar. It was the first time the royal family would appear together after months of uncertainty. A king recovering. A princess stepping back from public duties. Senior roles reshuffling quietly behind the scenes. For the monarchy, this wasn't a moment to gamble. And that is exactly why William hesitated. Not emotionally, but strategically. Because here's what most people forget. The balcony is not about family. It is about stability. Every year, that image is used across newspapers, broadcasts, documentaries, internet archives, proof that the monarchy still functions. And if Harry appeared next to William, smiling, waving, framed by centuries of tradition, what happens to the narrative? Suddenly, the years of tension dissolve in a single photograph. Public memory resets. And William knew that. He knew the cost of that image. So he did what future kings are expected to do. He protected the institution. But the story gets deeper, because Harry didn't make this request alone. Behind him were voices urging him on. People saying the same thing. Just one appearance could change everything. Not interviews. Not Netflix. Not memoirs. Just a balcony. A silent symbol doing the work of 10 public statements. But while Harry believed this could mend the story, William believed the opposite. To him, including Harry wasn't healing. It was reopening a wound in front of the world. And if you're wondering whether the brothers spoke directly, insiders say yes. Not formally, not warmly, but directly. The tone was calm, measured, not explosive like some expect. Because here's the surprising truth. They are not shouting. They are not fighting. They are drifting. Silently. Deliberately. Like two lines that used to intersect, but now run parallel, never touching. And that silence is heavier than any argument. Now let's look at another piece no one talks about. Christmas at Buckingham Palace is not just a photo opportunity. It is one of the few remaining rituals the monarchy cannot afford to mishandle. It isn't the time for risks. This year especially, the public is watching for reassurance. The government is watching for stability. The world is watching for unity. So ask yourself, if you were second in line to the throne, would you take a chance that the headlines would shift from royal strength to royal conflict? Because that's what was on the line. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness, not brotherhood, reputation. And William understands reputation more than anyone gives him credit for. He learned from the Queen. He learned from decades of watching the monarchy survive storms by never reacting emotionally. Which means saying no, even to his own brother, was not personal. It was calculated. But let's step into Harry's world for a minute. Because from his side, this was not just about optics. This was about timing. His public image has taken hit after hit. Controversial interviews, family revelations, silence from the palace. And for the first time, the momentum shifted away from him. He needed a win. Something symbolic. Something that couldn't be argued with. Standing on that balcony would have been that moment. This is why the request wasn't random. It was intentional. A single appearance could change public perception faster than any PR campaign. But Harry didn't anticipate one thing. William was already setting the tone for the next phase of the monarchy, and that phase didn't include uncertainty. He wasn't looking backwards. He was building forward. And in that plan, every public move mattered. Now here's where the tension rises. Because while William was making his decision, someone else entered the conversation. Not a senior aide, not a royal sibling, not a media advisor. Someone unexpected. Someone whose opinion carried emotional weight. Their message wasn't long. It wasn't dramatic. It was a warning. A quiet reminder that shutting Harry out completely might not be the safest option. The monarchy survives by staying predictable, not punitive. And for a moment, that warning landed. William paused, not to reconsider the outcome, but to reconsider how the outcome would be delivered. Because sometimes how you say no is more important than the no itself. This is where the story takes its sharpest turn. Because instead of responding publicly or allowing the media to leak, the palace stayed silent. Completely silent. No comment. No clarification. No denial. That silence became the message. And that silence was louder than a press release. Meanwhile, Harry waited. Insiders say he expected at least a conversation, a negotiation, maybe even a compromise. But days went by. Nothing changed. And then came the moment that shifted everything. William made his decision. Not through anger, not through frustration, but through certainty. He would not allow Harry on the balcony. Not this year. Not under these circumstances. And when the message was delivered, it was simple, direct, final, without room for interpretation. But here's the twist. The rejection wasn't the most shocking part. It was what happened immediately after. Because while Harry was processing that answer, something else unfolded. Something that neither brother anticipated. And it didn't happen in London. It happened somewhere else entirely. A development that would change the meaning of the Christmas appearance. A shift in the royal lineup. A decision that sent a message to the world without speaking a single word. And it was then, at that exact moment, that Harry realized something. This was not just a closed door. This was a turning point. But the most dramatic part? It wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Because what happened next would not only reshape Christmas Day, it would change the future of the royal family. And no one saw it coming. The request didn't arrive as a dramatic phone call. It wasn't a last-minute plea shouted across time zones. It wasn't emotional or chaotic. It was carefully timed, deliberate, measured, and according to those close to the situation, it was the most controlled approach Prince Harry has made toward the royal family in years. But let's start with the question that immediately grabs the audience. Why would Harry reach out now, after everything that has happened? Why would the man who stepped away from royal life, who spoke openly about his family, who built a life thousands of miles away, suddenly ask for something symbolically royal? What changed? Because people don't make requests like this without a reason. Especially not Harry. So let's break down what insiders claim happened. It wasn't just a text. It wasn't just an email. It wasn't a desperate voicemail at midnight. It was a message sent through a quiet channel the public rarely hears about. A channel used only when communication needs to be direct, but not emotional. That alone tells us something. Harry wasn't acting impulsively. He was strategizing. And here's the twist most people don't expect. This request wasn't shaped like an apology. It wasn't shaped like a confession. It wasn't even shaped like a reconciliation. It was framed as a consideration. A request, given the circumstances. That wording matters. Because it tells us Harry understood one thing clearly. He no longer holds the power to demand. So instead, he approached the situation like someone trying to re-enter a locked room without rattling the door. He knocked softly. And now the question becomes, what exactly did Harry say? Sources won't reveal the exact phrasing, and they never will, but they agree on the intent. Harry didn't ask for speeches. He didn't ask for headlines. He didn't ask to make an announcement or reclaim a title. He asked for visibility, to stand on the Buckingham Palace balcony, on Christmas Day, next to the family he once stood beside his entire life, until suddenly, he didn't. But here's where things get even more interesting. Harry didn't make the request casually. He chose his timing with precision. Early December, before travel schedules were finalized, before security teams were locked in, before the palace confirmed attendance lists. He reached out at a moment when the royal machinery was still flexible, but no longer early enough for the request to seem hypothetical. It was a tactical move, and that raises a haunting question. Was Harry trying to catch the palace before they could refuse, or before they could ignore him? Because there's a difference. Being told no hurts. Being told nothing is worse. But there's a deeper layer. This wasn't just about Harry. It was about what the balcony represents. To the public, it looks like a family waving. To the monarchy, it's a silent declaration. Only working royals stand there. Only those in the fold. Only those who represent the institution. So when Harry asked for that space, he wasn't asking for a view of the crowd. He was asking to cross a line that had already been drawn. But here's where the story sharpens. Harry wasn't acting from a place of anger. For the first time in a long time, sources say his tone was different. Not defensive, not defiant, almost restrained. Like someone who knew the answer might not be yes, but needed to try anyway. And that alone changes the emotional temperature of this story. Because whether you support him or not, one thing is undeniable. There is a difference between leaving voluntarily and being shut out. And Harry may have just realized which one applies to him now. But we need to ask the audience something, because it matters. If you walked away from a family system and then realized the door wasn't just left behind, but locked behind you, what would you do? Would you accept it? Or would you try to prove you still belonged? That's the emotional core of this chapter. Harry didn't request an apology. He didn't request a conversation. He requested presence, visibility, proof he still existed in the royal narrative. Because no matter how far someone moves, physically or emotionally, there comes a moment when reality catches up. And here's the reality. Harry's public influence is not what it used to be. The interviews? They've faded. The memoir? It shocked, then settled. The Netflix content? No longer headline generating. Public interest is shifting. Momentum is slowing. And for someone raised in the spotlight, that is not just a professional issue, it's a psychological one. So the balcony wasn't just an appearance. It was a reset button. A single photograph could do the work of years. But there's another side to this request, a side most people overlook. Harry didn't just ask to be seen. He asked to be seen without earning it back. Not through restored duties. Not through rebuilding trust. Not through a gradual return. He asked for the final step before taking the first one. And that put William in a position no brother wants to be in. Choosing between compassion and consistency. Choosing between personal history and institutional responsibility. Choosing between the person he grew up with and the role he was born for. And the moment Harry made the request, the balance shifted. Suddenly, this wasn't just about Christmas, it was about consequence. Because the monarchy may forgive quietly, but it never forgets publicly. And once a line is crossed, stepping back over it isn't simple, especially when the world is watching. Now here's where the chapter takes its first major turn. Harry didn't know it yet, but William was already aware of the request before it reached him. How? Because in the palace, nothing arrives untouched. Every message is filtered. Every communication is tracked. Every decision is measured before it lands. So when Harry reached out, the request didn't arrive on William's phone. It arrived through structures, through people trained to assess impact before emotion. That alone tells us something critical. This wasn't a family moment. It was a political moment, a strategic moment, and William reacted accordingly. He didn't jump. He didn't respond immediately. He paused. Silence can mean many things. In politics, silence is not uncertainty. It is control. William was calculating, not about whether he should say no, but how the refusal should shape the future. Because accepting Harry would send one message. Rejecting him would send another. But the way the rejection was delivered would send the biggest message of all. And just as William began weighing that decision, something unexpected entered the equation. A development Harry did not know about. A factor that changed the meaning of the balcony entirely. And from that moment forward, the situation was no longer about one request. It became something much bigger. Something Harry never saw coming. Because here's the part almost no one outside the palace understands. Harry wasn't just making a request into a vacuum. He was stepping into a timeline already in motion. By the time he reached out, plans were shifting behind the scenes. Roles were being reconsidered. Public appearances quietly adjusted. Internal expectations recalibrated. The royal family wasn't preparing for a reunion. They were preparing for a reset. And Harry's request didn't fit into that strategy. Not because he wasn't family, but because he wasn't part of the working structure anymore. That matters. Because the balcony isn't a sentimental tradition. It's a visual declaration of who represents the crown. Which brings us to the uncomfortable truth. Harry was asking for a symbolic privilege without the responsibility that comes with it. To the public, that may sound harsh. To the institution, it's reality. But let's focus on the emotional impact for a moment. Because this isn't a chessboard, it's a family. Harry wasn't just asking for a place to stand. He was asking not to be erased. Whether you support him or not, that is a deeply human fear. People leave families every day, but they don't expect the door to be locked behind them. So when Harry reached out, there was vulnerability under the strategy. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. A kind of quiet that makes rejection hurt more, not less. And here's where the chapter deepens. Because while Harry waited, something else unfolded. Something that changed the meaning of his request entirely. Inside Kensington Palace, William was already consulting with advisors. Not about Harry specifically, but about Christmas optics as a whole. This year mattered. It wasn't just another calendar event. The monarchy was recovering from months of tightened appearances and shifting visibility. They needed stability, not uncertainty. They needed predictability, not headlines. So let's ask the audience directly. If you were the future king, standing on the edge of a new era, would you risk the most symbolic moment of the year being overshadowed by a single facial expression? A single photograph? A single headline? Because that's all it takes. The balcony is a silent moment. No speeches, no statements, just cameras. And sometimes silence is the most dangerous part of all. Harry may have seen the balcony as neutral ground, a chance to stand without speaking. But William saw something different. He saw a risk that the narrative would shift from strength to speculation, from unity to hypocrisy, from stability to crisis management. And the monarchy has learned one lesson over decades. Once the public questions the image, the institution begins to fracture. William wasn't about to let that happen on his watch. Not now. Not at Christmas. Not when the stakes were highest. But there was still one more layer to this moment, and it's the part that stings the most. Harry expected a response. Not just an answer, a conversation. He believed there would be room to negotiate, room to explain, room to appeal. Instead, he was met with controlled silence. Not accidental, not emotional. Strategic. Because silence has power. It leaves no quotes for the press, no audio for documentaries, no wording that can be twisted or leaked. Silence is the palace's safest weapon. But the longer Harry waited, the more the reality crystallized. This wasn't hesitation. It was exclusion. And there's something uniquely painful about realizing the door hasn't just been closed. It's been closed without discussion. But here is the turning point of the entire chapter. Just when Harry believed the situation was still in motion, it wasn't. Because while he was waiting for a reply, William already had one. The decision was made. It just hadn't been delivered yet. That gap between decision and delivery is where the real emotional tension sits. Harry thought the silence meant consideration. In truth, it meant conclusion. And then came the detail that changes everything. William didn't just say no. He set a boundary. A boundary that insiders say was firm, final, and without exception. But the reason behind that boundary wasn't personal, it was institutional. It wasn't about punishment, it was about precedent. If Harry stood on the balcony, so could anyone who stepped away and then wanted back in temporarily. It would blur the lines, undermine the structure, turn royal duty into optional attendance. And William, raised under a queen who believed consistency was survival, refused to let that happen. Not now. Not ever. But here's where the chapter takes its final dramatic turn. Just as the message was prepared to reach Harry, something else happened behind the scenes, something no one predicted. A development that didn't cancel the decision, but intensified it. It wasn't about Harry. It wasn't even about William. It was about someone else entirely. Someone whose involvement would shift the entire emotional meaning of Christmas Day. And when Harry finally learned what had happened, everything about the balcony request changed. Not just the outcome, but the interpretation. Because suddenly, it wasn't just a rejection. It was something much bigger. Something Harry never imagined. And no one, not even palace staff, saw it coming. Silence is a strange thing inside Kensington Palace. To the outside world, it looks calm, controlled, almost graceful. But behind the scenes, silence can mean only one of two things. A storm is about to begin, or a decision has already been made. And in this case, the silence surrounding Harry's request meant the second. Because the moment William received the message, he didn't react emotionally. He didn't respond impulsively. He didn't pace the room or fire off frustration. He went still, completely still. The kind of stillness that only happens when someone already knows the answer and now has to decide how much of themselves to reveal in the delivery. Here's what most people forget. William is not just a brother. He is a future king. Every word he speaks now carries weight. Every decision sets precedent. Every action echoes beyond family walls. So when Harry's request reached him, William approached it the way a monarch in training is expected to. Not with his heart, with his strategy. Because saying yes would have been emotional. Saying nothing was intentional. And saying no, the final no, would reshape more than Christmas. It would define the boundaries of the monarchy moving forward. But before William spoke a single word, something important happened. He waited, not because he was unsure, but because timing matters. Inside the palace, decisions are never rushed. Every move is examined from multiple angles. How will the press interpret it? How will the public react? What message will this send internationally? And, most importantly, what precedent will this create? Because in the royal world, once a door is opened, it cannot be closed quietly. So William did what his grandmother taught him, not through conversation, but through observation. He paused, not long, not dramatically, but long enough to ensure his response protected the institution, not just the moment. And here's where the chapter gets interesting. While the public imagines William reacting as a brother, insiders say he reacted as something else entirely. He reacted as the future head of state, which raises a chilling question. When duty demands a boundary, what happens to brotherhood? Because there is a point where personal history no longer outweighs national responsibility. And William may have just crossed that point. Let's go deeper. The first thing William did wasn't to respond. It was to evaluate. He spoke with his closest advisors, not many, just a select few. The kind of people who have been trained for decades to see consequences before they happen. These advisors don't deal in emotion. They deal in optics. And the optics here were dangerous. Let's break down why. If William allowed Harry to appear on the balcony, even for a brief moment, three things would happen instantly. The press would label it a reconciliation. Harry's public image would reset overnight. The monarchy would appear inconsistent. And the monarchy cannot afford inconsistency. Not now. Not with public trust shifting. Not with political stability tied to symbolic strength. Not after months of reserved appearances due to health concerns. So William understood something brutally simple. One moment of sympathy could cost years of stability. And that's the kind of calculation no brother wants to make, but a future king must. But here's where things become more complicated. William wasn't just weighing the public consequences. He was weighing the private ones. Because once a boundary is broken, it doesn't just affect the institution, it affects the family dynamic permanently. Allowing Harry back onto the balcony would do more than create a photo. It would erase consequences. It would signal that stepping away comes without cost. It would send a message not just to Harry, but to every future royal watching from the sidelines. You can leave and still return whenever it suits you. And William refused to let that message take root. Not under his leadership, not at the start of a new royal era. But this decision didn't come without emotional weight. Because despite everything, Harry is still his brother. They share memories no one else on earth understands. Walking behind their mother's coffin. Growing up under constant surveillance. Losing childhood privacy before they understood what privacy meant. There is a bond between them that no headline can rewrite. But there is also a fracture. One that no conversation has repaired. Not yet. Maybe not ever. So William found himself standing in a place he never expected, having to choose between the brother he once protected and the crown he is now responsible for protecting. That is not a choice anyone should have to make. And yet, he made it. Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Because in the royal world, clarity is not cold, it is survival. But here comes the part almost no one expected. William wasn't only thinking about Harry, he was thinking about someone else. Someone whose presence would define the tone of Christmas far more than Harry ever could. Someone whose role in the family had quietly shifted and now mattered more than the world realized. That person became the turning point in William's decision. Not Meghan, not King Charles, not even a senior advisor. Someone closer. Someone whose influence sits behind the scenes, not in front of cameras. And the moment their perspective entered the conversation, the decision hardened. Not softened, hardened. Because they reminded William of one truth he could not ignore. Letting Harry return publicly without repairing things privately would only delay the fallout, not prevent it. It would create a photograph without a foundation. And photographs fade. Consequences don't. But the story doesn't end with that reminder. Because just when the decision seemed final, something else happened. Something that froze the palace in place. A message arrived. Not from Harry. Not from the public. Not from the media. From someone William never expected to weigh in. Someone who shifted the emotional temperature of the entire situation. And for the first time, William didn't just hesitate for strategy. He hesitated for something deeper, something personal. And that hesitation didn't change his answer. but it changed everything else. To understand why that unexpected message mattered, we need to step inside the one space the public never gets to see: William's inner circle. Because contrary to what tabloids suggest, William doesn't make decisions surrounded by chaos. He makes them surrounded by calm. There are no raised voices, no emotional debates, no dramatic confrontations. There is structure. He consults only with people who have earned permanent access, not through status, but through loyalty and restraint. And when the message arrived, it didn't interrupt a crisis. It interrupted silence. The kind of silence that happens when a decision is already formed and everyone in the room knows it. So what was in that message? Insiders won't reveal details, and that secrecy alone tells us how sensitive it was. But they agree on one thing. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't pressure. It was concern. Not for Harry, for William. Because whether the public sees it or not, the decisions William makes now don't just define the monarchy, they define him. Every boundary becomes part of his future legacy. Every refusal sets a tone for how he will rule. And someone close to him wanted to remind him of one truth he couldn't ignore. Once a line is drawn between brothers, it is nearly impossible to erase. Not politically, not emotionally, and not historically. That message didn't soften William's decision. It sharpened it. Because instead of thinking about the next month, he started thinking about the next decade. That's the difference between reacting as a sibling and reacting as a monarch. But let's shift perspectives for a moment. Imagine being William. You wake up every day knowing that every move you make will be dissected, criticized, measured, and archived. Your private emotions are irrelevant. Your personal relationships are secondary. Your life is no longer your own. It is preparation for a role that will never end. Now add this. Your brother, the only person who understands what that life truly feels like, steps away. Not quietly, not privately, but publicly. And in doing so, he doesn't just leave the family. He leaves the burden. He leaves the pressure. He leaves the expectations. And you're the one who remains. Still standing. Still responsible. Still watched. So when Harry asks to return, not fully, just symbolically, what are you supposed to do? Welcome him back for a moment that costs you everything? Or hold the boundary that keeps the institution standing? That is the position William found himself in. It wasn't personal, but it was painful. Because no matter how calm he appears, William is not made of stone. He just learned to live like it. Now let's look at the emotional undertone that almost no one acknowledges. Harry's request didn't remind William of conflict. It reminded him of loss. Not just the loss of a brother, but the loss of a version of their lives that can never be restored. A time when everything made sense. Before cameras, before pressure, before expectations, before the world took their childhood and turned it into history. So when William paused, it wasn't hesitation. It was grief. Silent, private grief. Because rejecting a stranger is easy. Rejecting your past is not. But even grief doesn't erase responsibility. And here's where the chapter tightens. William wasn't only considering the emotional fallout. He was considering the message it would send to the public. Because whether the world admits it or not, people look for meaning in royal appearances. If Harry stood beside William, millions would interpret it as forgiveness, unity, healing, a return. And William knew none of those things were true. Not yet. Maybe not ever. So allowing Harry on the balcony would have created a lie. A polished photograph covering an unhealed wound. And the monarchy cannot afford fiction. Not anymore. Not with scrutiny at the highest it has been in decades. Not with an entire generation questioning whether the institution still matters. If William created an illusion of unity without the reality of unity, the backlash would be catastrophic. Not immediately, but eventually. Because illusions always crack. And when they do, the damage is twice as deep. So William did something the public rarely gives him credit for. He chose truth over optics. Even though the truth hurt. Even though the truth made him look cold. Even though the truth would create headlines he never asked for. That is the cost of leadership. But now we reach the most revealing moment of this chapter. Because just when the palace was preparing to communicate the decision, a new factor entered the conversation, one that no one predicted. And it didn't come from inside the UK. It came from outside, a development abroad. Something involving a member of the royal family whose recent absence had created more questions than answers. Suddenly, the Christmas appearance wasn't just about who would stand on the balcony. It became about who could, and that changed the emotional landscape instantly. Because if another senior royal was returning, even briefly, then allowing Harry back would completely shift the narrative. It would look deliberate, timed, orchestrated, and William could not let that interpretation exist, not even for a moment. So instead of reconsidering the decision, he reinforced it. The timing hardened the refusal, not because of Harry's request, but because of everything happening around it. Harry had unknowingly stepped into the worst possible moment, not just politically, emotionally, symbolically, because while he was preparing for a moment of visibility, the palace was preparing for something else, a display of continuity, a reminder that the monarchy persists regardless of who steps away. And nothing could interfere with that message, not even blood. But the chapter doesn't end with William's strengthened resolve, because what happened next wasn't about strategy. It was about delivery. How do you tell your own brother no, without destroying whatever is left of your relationship? How do you protect the monarchy without appearing cruel? How do you close a door without appearing to slam it? William found his answer. It wasn't an email. It wasn't a public statement. It wasn't leaked. It was something far more personal and far more unexpected. But that delivery didn't lead to closure. It led to something else, something Harry never anticipated, something that would change not just Christmas Day, but everything that came after it. And no one, not even William, was prepared for the consequences. People think this story begins at Christmas. It doesn't. It began years earlier. Long before Harry sent that quiet request. Long before William weighed his response. Long before the silence between them became louder than any argument could have been. Because the truth is this: what happened over the balcony wasn't a sudden break. It was the latest chapter in a fracture that didn't happen publicly. It happened privately. And almost no one knows when the real turning point occurred. So let's go back. Not to the interviews. Not to the headlines. Not to the documentaries. Earlier. To the moment that insiders say changed everything, and not in front of cameras. Behind them. Because the divide between the brothers didn't explode overnight. It eroded, slowly, quietly, like a crack forming beneath the surface, invisible at first, until one day, it wasn't. And here's the question that pulls us in. Was the breaking point something the world saw, or something no one noticed at the time? Let's rewind to the period right after the Queen's funeral. On the outside, the images looked peaceful. William and Harry walking side by side. Public unity. Calm expressions. Shared grief. But grief does strange things. It exposes what was already fragile. Because sometimes tragedy pulls people together. And sometimes it reveals distance that has been there all along. According to sources close to both sides, the private atmosphere during that time was not hostile. It was hollow. There were no shouting matches. No confrontations. No dramatic ultimatums. Just distance. A kind of emotional emptiness that felt harder than conflict. Because conflict can be fixed. Silence can't. What the public didn't see was what insiders describe as the after effect. Once the cameras were gone, communication didn't continue. It faded. Texts became fewer. Calls stopped happening. Updates came through staff instead of directly. Not because of one event, but because of accumulated exhaustion. Too much had been said. Too much had been exposed. Too much had been left unresolved. And here's something the world often forgets. Sometimes the most final endings are not dramatic. They are quiet. A slow withdrawing. A gentle shutting of doors. A gradual acceptance that things are no longer what they used to be. But the fracture didn't start there either. To understand this story, we need to go back even further. Not to adult decisions, but childhood realities. Because William and Harry were not raised like normal siblings. They were raised in a structure. One destined for responsibility. The other destined for support. One trained to become the center, the other trained to orbit around it. And whether anyone admits it or not, that dynamic shapes a family forever. For decades, Harry had a role, not just as William's brother, but as the person who stood beside the future king. A shadow role, a support position, important but secondary. And for a long time, that structure worked. They balanced each other, laughed together, protected one another. Then adulthood arrived, and the structure tightened. William moved deeper into duty. Harry moved further into individuality. The paths began to separate, not suddenly, gradually, which brings us to the most overlooked part of this entire story. The public believes the royal rift began with one interview. Insiders say it began with one realization. Harry didn't want the life he was born into, and William couldn't leave the one forced upon him. That is not conflict. That is tragedy. Two brothers shaped by a system neither of them designed. One resentful of being trapped in it, the other resentful of being left to carry it alone. But the world didn't see that complexity. They saw headlines, explosive ones, and headlines don't tell the truth. They simplify it, turn pain into entertainment, turn nuance into sides, turn brothers into opponents. But here's the twist. Even during the worst moments, even when the public believed they were enemies, insiders say the brothers were not at war. They were disconnected. And disconnection is far more dangerous. War ends. Disconnection becomes permanent. So when Harry sent the balcony request this year, he wasn't reaching out from a place of active conflict. He was reaching out across a silence years in the making. A silence that began long before he left the UK. Long before the interviews. Long before the book. The book didn't create the distance. It documented it. But there is still one moment that insiders describe as the turning point. The moment after which everything felt different. It did not happen in front of the world. It did not happen during a major event. It happened in private. A conversation behind closed doors. Not explosive. Not dramatic. Just final. A moment where both brothers realized something neither wanted to admit. They were no longer speaking the same language. William was thinking like a future monarch. Harry was thinking like someone who wanted out. And once two people start living in different realities, the bridge between them doesn't collapse. It disappears. By the time Christmas came around this year, that bridge wasn't damaged. It was gone. Which brings us back to the present. When Harry made his request, he wasn't knocking on a familiar door. He was knocking on a door that had not been opened in years. But here's the twist that deepens this chapter even further. Harry believed time might have softened things. He believed distance might have healed something. He believed the family's recent challenges might have reopened space for empathy. But William didn't see it that way. Not because he was cold, but because he had spent those same years doing something Harry wasn't part of. Preparing for the future. Not emotionally, institutionally. And once someone begins living in the future, they stop revisiting the past. Harry reached backward. William stepped forward. And that is the moment the path split permanently. But the most surprising part? None of this was inevitable. There was a moment, a single moment, when things could have gone differently. A moment no one talks about. A moment that insiders say was the last real chance at reconciliation. And it didn't happen at a funeral, or a coronation, or a public gathering. It happened somewhere unexpected, somewhere private, somewhere only a handful of people know about. And that moment changed everything. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. And once that moment passed, the balcony request was no longer a gesture toward healing. It became something else entirely. A reminder of what had been lost, and a reminder of what could no longer be restored. But the most shocking part of this chapter is still ahead, because the turning point wasn't in the past. It was coming in the present, a moment that neither brother anticipated. A moment that would force both of them to face the truth, not about the past, but about what their relationship had become. And when that moment arrived, it wouldn't just redefine Christmas. It would reshape the future of the royal family to understand the moment that changed everything. We need to go to a scene almost no one outside palace walls knows about. It didn't happen in front of cameras. It didn't happen during a royal event. It happened quietly. In a private room, with no audience and no script. This was the moment insiders now refer to as the last real conversation. Not the last time William and Harry spoke, but the last time they spoke as brothers instead of representatives of two different worlds. According to those aware of the meeting, the conversation wasn't heated. There were no accusations, no emotional breakdowns, no shouting. Just two men sitting across from each other, both waiting for the other to say something that would fix everything, and neither able to do it. The tension wasn't in what was said. It was in what wasn't. Harry wanted acknowledgement, of hurt, of misunderstanding, of change. William wanted commitment, to structure, to responsibility, to loyalty. But here's the problem. You cannot negotiate two different realities. So the conversation ended not with closure, but with acceptance. A quiet realization on both sides. They were no longer walking the same path. And from that moment on, every interaction became less about repairing the past and more about avoiding making the fracture worse. Which explains the silence that followed. Not avoidance. Self-protection. When people talk about royal fallout, they imagine dramatic confrontations. In truth, most relationships don't end with explosions. They end with exhaustion. By the time the balcony request was made, neither brother was trying to win. They were trying not to lose what little remained. But here's the part that makes this moment so emotionally complex. Harry didn't know the door had closed. Not fully. Not permanently. He believed distance meant time to heal. William believed distance meant time to stabilize. Two different meanings. One irreversible misunderstanding. And that brings us to the most important realization of this chapter. Harry thought there was still a bridge. William knew the bridge was gone. Not destroyed. Dismantled. Piece by piece. Not by anger, but by reality. So when Harry reached out this Christmas, he was stepping onto something he thought still existed. And William saw a request that didn't match the truth anymore. But the story doesn't end there, because while the past explains the fracture, it doesn't explain the timing. Why now? Why would Harry ask for a balcony moment after years of distance? The answer, insiders say, is surprisingly human. Harry had reached a point of recalibration. Not just publicly, personally. For the first time, the consequences of stepping away had become real. Not symbolic. Real. Relationships don't remain frozen just because someone leaves. They move on without you. And Harry may have only recently realized that the family he assumed he could return to at any moment had continued forward without him. Not intentionally. Not cruelly. Simply because life doesn't pause. Even for princes. And here's the part that hits the hardest. Harry wasn't trying to reclaim power. He was trying not to disappear. Because the balcony isn't about status. It's about visibility. And whether the world admits it or not, visibility is currency. Especially for someone who built a new identity outside the institution that once defined him. So the request wasn't random. It was a response. A response to fading influence. A response to shifting public interest. A response to the realization that distance has a cost no one warns you about. But William wasn't seeing the request through emotional context. He was seeing it through structural consequences. Harry was thinking as an individual. William was thinking as an institution. And when those two perspectives collide, nobody wins. Which leads to the final and most powerful layer of this chapter. Because while the past explains the fracture and the timing explains the request, there was still one more element that shaped William's reaction. The monarchy was entering a period of fragility. This wasn't a year for unpredictable optics. It was a year for control, a year for stability, a year when even small missteps could trigger massive speculation. And in moments like that, symbols matter more than people. So William didn't see the balcony as a family gesture. He saw it as a message. And messages cannot be accidental. Which brings us to the emotional truth at the center of this chapter. Harry reached out hoping the past might soften the present. William responded knowing the present had already redefined the past. There was no shared understanding left. Just two interpretations of the same history. Two memories that no longer aligned. Two lives moving in different directions, permanently. And the balcony request didn't create that reality. It revealed it. But the chapter does not end here. Because while the past explains how the fracture formed, it doesn't explain what came next. Because just when the distance between the brothers seemed fixed and unchangeable, something unexpected happened. Something no one, not Harry, not William, not the palace, saw coming. A shift that would pull the situation out of the past and into the present. A moment that forced the royal family to confront not what had happened, but what was about to happen. And that moment didn't just change the meaning of Christmas. It changed everything that followed. Inside Kensington Palace, The atmosphere wasn't tense. It was controlled. While the outside world imagined whispering staff, hurried strategy meetings, and panicked phone calls, the reality was much quieter. Because when it comes to the royal family, the most consequential decisions aren't made during chaos. They're made during calm. And that's exactly what was unfolding behind closed doors. But before we dive into what happened inside the palace, let's start with a question that pulls the audience in. What does a royal family do when a decision affects both blood and the throne? Do they react emotionally? Or do they plan? In this case, they planned. Because William's refusal wasn't just a private response, it was an institutional strategy. And the moment Harry's request became known inside palace walls, something began happening in the background. A new plan was set into motion. Not a plan about Harry, a plan about Christmas. Because while Harry believed he was the central factor in this moment, the palace was focused on something else entirely. The message the royal family would send to the world, without speaking. So let's step inside one of the most guarded spaces in the monarchy. The pre-Christmas planning briefings. These are not dramatic meetings with dozens of voices. They are small, hand-picked, structured. Only a few senior figures are present, the ones responsible for shaping royal visibility. Their goal isn't emotional sensitivity. Their goal is stability. And this year, the stakes were higher than usual. Health concerns had reduced public appearances. Uncertainty had shifted public perception. Rumors had filled the silence. The Christmas balcony moment was not just tradition. It was reassurance, a signal that the monarchy remained intact, which means every detail mattered. Who stood where? Who appeared? Who didn't? How long the family stayed outside? What message the lineup would send? Even the smallest adjustment could ignite speculation. So when Harry's request entered the equation, it clashed with a plan already built around one priority. No surprises. No unexpected headlines. No emotional interpretations. Because here's something the public rarely understands. The royal balcony is not spontaneous. It is choreographed, not for vanity, but for meaning. Every placement communicates something. Unity, hierarchy, continuity. And continuity was the theme of the year. But now comes the part that changes everything. William wasn't just shaping the lineup. He was shaping the future narrative. According to sources, he wanted this Christmas to mark what insiders quietly called the beginning of the new phase. Not dramatic, not announced, just visible. A subtle transition, moving the public's attention forward, toward stability, not tension. Harry didn't know that. He thought he was asking for a moment. In reality, he was stepping into a strategy already in motion, and that strategy had no space for unpredictability. Which brings us to the next question. Did anyone inside the palace push for Harry to be included? Surprisingly, yes. Not publicly, not aggressively, but with caution. A senior figure reportedly warned that excluding Harry completely could deepen the divide, making future reconciliation harder. And more dramatic if it ever happened. Their argument was simple. Sometimes maintaining a thread, even a thin one, prevents a permanent break. But even that perspective didn't shift the plan. Because the decision wasn't about preventing emotional fallout. It was about preventing public confusion. If Harry suddenly appeared on the balcony, the world would interpret it as forgiveness. And forgiveness implies resolution. There was no resolution. Not privately, not emotionally. And the monarchy doesn't perform unity it cannot sustain. So William held firm. But here's where the chapter takes an unexpected turn. While discussions were unfolding inside Kensington Palace, something was happening at Buckingham Palace simultaneously. Two palaces, two atmospheres, two different concerns. Buckingham wasn't focused on Harry. They were focused on logistics, security, timing, protocol. Because Christmas Day is not run like a casual family gathering. It is treated like a state event, even if the public doesn't see it that way. Which means every decision must be finalized early. But Harry's request introduced a complication. Not because they planned to include him, but because they had to prepare in case the situation changed. And this is where the emotional weight comes in. While the public thinks the palace slammed the door quickly, the truth is more painful. They had to consider the possibility, briefly, before closing it. Not because they wanted to, because they're required to. Every scenario must be evaluated, even unlikely ones. So for a short period, Harry existed in the planning documents. A hypothetical, a possibility. And that, in some ways, is more painful than an immediate no, because it means the door wasn't always closed. It was slowly shut, deliberately, not in anger, in caution. But now we reach the most compelling part of the chapter. Because while William was considering strategy and Buckingham was managing logistics, another shift was happening beneath the surface. Public sentiment. Small at first, quiet, barely noticeable, but growing. People weren't asking whether Harry should return. They were asking what his absence would mean. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about who would appear. It was about who wouldn't. And absence is sometimes louder than presence. The palace knew that. Which is why the decision wasn't just whether Harry would stand on the balcony. It was whether the message of his absence could be controlled. And that brings us to the final twist of this chapter. Before William delivered his final answer, something else happened inside Kensington Palace. Something that changed the emotional temperature of the entire situation. Not a leak, not a confrontation, a conversation, a private warning. And the person who delivered it wasn't expected to weigh in at all. Not a staff member, not an advisor, someone much closer. Someone whose voice carries weight not because of authority, but because of personal history. And what they told William did not change the decision, but it changed the stakes. Because they reminded him, once you shut a door on family, truly shut it, you cannot open it again without consequence. And that realization didn't stop William. It strengthened him. But the moment that followed, no one, not even William, was ready for. Because just as the palace prepared to move forward with the final plan, news arrived that shifted everything. Not about Harry, not about William, about someone else entirely. Someone whose involvement would change the meaning of Christmas Day and the consequences of shutting Harry out. And that moment was only the beginning. The message didn't arrive dramatically. No urgent knock on the door. No panicked whisper from a staff member. No sudden disruption of palace routine. It came quietly. A discreet update. Delivered in the calm tone palace staff use only when the information is serious, but not yet public. And when William heard it, everything around him shifted. Not his expression, not his posture, just the atmosphere. Because the news wasn't about Harry's request. It was about someone whose presence would redefine the Christmas appearance entirely. Someone whose return was never guaranteed. Someone whose absence had already changed the royal landscape. This update forced the palace to rethink everything. Not the decision, but the meaning of the decision. Because if this person appeared at Christmas, the message would be unmistakable. The royal family was stabilizing, without Harry. And that changed the emotional weight of the balcony moment completely. Let's slow this down. For weeks, the palace had been operating under uncertainty. Every plan was built with caution. Every lineup was designed with flexibility. No one wanted to confirm appearances prematurely. So when the update arrived, it created a shift, not in logistics, but in symbolism. Suddenly, the balcony was no longer just a tradition. It became a statement, a turning point, a visual declaration that the monarchy was moving forward, even if not everyone was able to stand beside them anymore. And here's the part almost no one outside the palace understands. When one royal returns, another royal's absence gains weight. Silence becomes louder. Distance becomes defined. The public starts asking different questions. Instead of, will Harry come back? They start asking, why isn't he there? And that's the kind of story the palace cannot control once it begins. So William faced a new challenge, one he hadn't anticipated. How do you stand firm in a decision without allowing the world to misinterpret it? Because even though the refusal was deliberate and carefully considered, the updated circumstances meant the optics had changed. Suddenly, the decision no longer looked strategic. It looked symbolic, even personal, and that was dangerous. Because William wasn't rejecting Harry as a brother. He was protecting the monarchy as a future king. But now it risked appearing the other way around. Which meant the delivery, the way the decision reached Harry, mattered more than ever. Inside Kensington Palace, the tone shifted from planning to precision. No leaks, no missteps, no accidental messaging. This wasn't just about saying no.